When everyone in Westeros looked to the sky and saw dragons, or fixed their eyes on that cold iron throne forged from the surrendered swords of defeated lords, they were completely missing the real threat that was slowly gathering its strength. For generations, the Seven Kingdoms had been entirely preoccupied with their endless betrayals, their petty political intrigues, and their devastating civil wars. The Starks prided themselves on their ancient honor and their unbreakable connection to the North. The Lannisters relied on their immense wealth and their ruthless intellect to buy loyalty and crush rebellions. And the Targaryens believed that their dragons and their fire made them little closer to gods than men. However, in the vast and intricate universe created by George R.R. Martin, the story of A Song of Ice and Fire was never merely meant to be a historical drama about a struggle for feudal power. It was always fundamentally a story about humanity's profound and tragic blindness in the face of a true existential threat. While the lords and ladies played their Game of Thrones in the warm southern courts, drinking summer wine and plotting assassinations, a much older, darker, and deadlier truth was awakening in the deep north, far beyond the magical barrier of the wall. We all watched Game of Thrones, captivated by the battle for a chair made of ugly metal. But the Night King was the ultimate embodiment, the frozen and physical manifestation of Westeros' greatest and most ancient mistake. He was the consequence of a forgotten past coming back to claim the present. To truly understand what the Night King is, how he was created, and why he desires nothing but the absolute eradication of life, we must go back to the very beginning of recorded history, to the dawn of time when the continent of Westeros was still wild and untamed. We have to look back to the ancient era when the first men crossed the Arm of Dorne and set foot in Westeros for the very first time. When these early humans arrived on this new continent, they quickly realized they were not alone. The vast, deep woods of Westeros were inhabited by the Children of the Forest, an ancient, mysterious, and non-human race that lived in perfect harmony with nature. They possessed profound magical abilities. They worshipped the old gods of the forest, and they carved faces into the sacred weirwood trees to watch over the land. For a time, perhaps there might have been a tentative peace, but humans did what humans historically always do when faced with the unknown and the untamed. They conquered, they destroyed, and they slaughtered. The first men wanted the land for their farms, their holdfasts, and their castles. They feared the magic of the children and the watching faces on the trees. So they brought their bronze axes and chopped down the sacred weirwoods, burning them to ashes. A brutal and desperate war began, one that lasted for generations. Despite their powerful magic, the Children of the Forest were physically smaller, less numerous, and technologically inferior to the first men. They were being systematically hunted down and pushed to the absolute verge of extinction. Desperation, as history constantly reminds us, is the mother of the most terrible and catastrophic inventions. Driven to the absolute brink by the relentless advance of mankind, the remaining Children of the Forest gathered in the deep, dark places of the world to perform a dark and terrible magic. Driven by the fear of their total annihilation, they made the fatal mistake that would change the fate of Westeros forever, a mistake that would haunt the world for thousands of years. They captured one of the first men, a captive of war, and tied him tightly to one of their remaining sacred weirwood trees. As the man struggled and the magic gathered around them, they plunged a cursed piece of magical dragon glass deep into his chest. The ritual was agonizing and dark. The man's humanity was violently stripped away from him. His skin turned pale as ice, and his eyes transformed into the deepest, darkest, most terrifying shade of piercing blue. Thus, the first White Walker was born. The Night King was brought into existence not by gods, but by a desperate, dying race. He was designed to be the ultimate biological weapon, an unstoppable force created solely to combat the first men, to push them back, and to protect the Children of the Forest from extinction. Yet, like any absolute power that cannot be tamed, and like every terrible weapon created in the name of self-defense, he ultimately turned on and betrayed his creators. The Night King did not just hate the first men. The dark magic inside him made him the enemy of life itself. He became the very antithesis of warmth, heartbeat, and existence. He was the direct result of Westeros' original sin. He was the horrific price that had to be paid because mankind massacred nature out of greed, and because the children of the forest disrupted the natural balance of life and death with their dark magic. Like a monstrous, icy parallel to Frankenstein's monster, the Night King escaped his creator's grasp, turned against the children of the forest, just as he turned against men, and swore silently to freeze and destroy the entire continent, bringing about a long night that would never end. In many beloved fantasy universes, there are traditional Dark Lord figures who drive the narrative forward. There are villains with grand ambitions, those who speak in long monologues, those who wish to conquer lands, enslave populations, and rule over empires with an iron fist. But the Night King is completely different from these conventional villains. He is not a dictator with political ambitions. He does not wish to sit on the Iron Throne. He does not care about taxes, and he does not want subjects to bow to him. He does not negotiate, he does not threaten, and he is entirely silent. He is silent because he is an unstoppable, uncaring force of nature. George R.R. Martin masterfully uses the White Walkers as the perfect allegory for an impending, undeniable global catastrophe. The famous Stark words, "Winter is coming," are not merely a meteorological warning about a seasonal change. They point to the great inevitable disaster that will bring an end to all humanity if left unchecked. While the arrogant lords and queens in the sunny south scheme and fight for borders, trade routes, and fragile crowns, a literal and metaphorical deadly winter is steadily advancing from the north. The climate is changing, the cold is creeping in, and the dead are walking. This narrative structure is a brilliant and direct reflection of our own real-world leaders who constantly ignore massive, existential crises such as climate change or global pandemics in favor of focusing entirely on their own short-sighted political power games and economic gains. Furthermore, when you look closely at the army of the dead, the whites that the Night King raises with a simple lift of his arms, you realize a profound and terrifying truth. In that massive horde of rotting flesh and bone, you cannot tell who was once a king, who was a lowly peasant, who was rich with Lannister gold, or who was a poor beggar from Flea Bottom. Death, in the hands of the Night King, is the ultimate and absolute equalizer. The White Walkers strip away all societal constructs, slapping the audience and the characters in the face with how utterly meaningless and pathetic the wars for the throne really are. All the Lannister gold in Casterly Rock can buy absolutely nothing in the face of death. All the Tyrell crops cannot feed a dead man. The Night King is essentially the physical, freezing manifestation of war and consequence. A silent punisher awakened as a direct result of humans' insatiable greed, their lack of foresight, and their endless slaughter of one another. However, the deepest and most philosophical part of the Night King's story lies not just in his creation, but in his ultimate, singular target. When the long night finally arrived again and the dead breached the wall, pouring into Westeros, the Night King had choices. He could have made Jon Snow, the resurrected hero and secret heir, his primary target. He could have sought out Daenerys Targaryen, the mother of dragons, to extinguish her fire once and for all. He could have marched straight for King's Landing to slaughter Cersei Lannister and claim the capital. But he did not care about any of them. His icy eyes were set on one single, seemingly helpless person, Bran Stark, the paralyzed boy who had become the three-eyed raven. Why Bran? The answer reveals the true horror of the Night King's mission. Samwell Tarly summarized this perfectly during the War Council at Winterfell by stating a profound philosophical truth. Death is not just a cessation of biological life. Death is forgetting. True death is not just ceasing to breathe, but being entirely erased from history. If you want to completely erase a people, to destroy an entire civilization, you do not just kill their bodies. You must first burn their books, destroy their monuments, and erase their memory. Bran Stark was not just a boy in a wheelchair anymore. He was the living, breathing memory of the entire world. His mind was an infinite library containing all the mistakes, the heroisms, the love stories, the betrayals, and the hard-learned lessons of the past thousands of years. The Night King's goal was never just to kill the living population of Westeros. That was merely a necessary step. His true goal was to bring about the endless night, a state of absolute, eternal stasis. For this true oblivion to be achieved, he required that absolutely no memory of humanity remain. By seeking out and killing Bran, the Night King wanted to permanently erase the past and the identity of humanity. Without a past, without a history to learn from or a story to tell, a species ceases to exist in any meaningful way. The Night King wanted to turn the vibrant, chaotic, and loud world into an empty, silent, and freezing graveyard where nothing would ever grow, change, or be remembered again. Bran was the hard drive of humanity, and the Night King was the virus intent on wiping it clean forever. And here lies the true, cynical, and devastatingly tragic message of Game of Thrones. Throughout the entire span of the series, we watched as humanity struggled and constantly failed to unite, even when faced with the literal end of the world. Cersei Lannister sat in the Red Keep sipping wine and flatly refused to send a single soldier to help the North, even as she knew the dead were marching. She decided that watching her political enemies potentially destroy each other in a war for survival suited her selfish interests far better than ensuring the survival of the human race. She gambled the existence of humanity on the chance of maintaining her grip on power. But the tragedy deepens when we look at what happened after the Great War was won. When Arya Stark's dagger pierced the Night King, shattering him into a million pieces of ice, and the entire army of the dead collapsed into dust, what did humanity do? Did they experience a profound collective enlightenment? Did they look at the fragility of life and decide to start living in peace, harmony, and mutual respect? Did they learn from the fact that they almost went extinct? Absolutely not. The very next day after the greatest existential threat in history was eliminated, the very moment the icy winds stopped blowing, the survivors immediately went right back to playing the Game of Thrones. The political scheming resumed without missing a beat. The fragile alliances shattered. Daenerys Targaryen, the savior from the East, succumbed to her own darkest impulses and family madness. King's Landing, a city of 1 million people, was reduced to ash and rubble, not by the cold magic of the White Walkers, but by the scorching dragon fire of a human queen. Innocents, children, and the elderly were once again brutally slaughtered, completely burned alive by the very rulers who claimed they wanted to break the wheel and save them. The most staggering and horrifying truth the story tells us is not that ice zombies exist in the dark, but that the greatest monster in the world is not made of magical ice or mythical fire. The greatest, most destructive monster is humanity itself. The Night King was, in essence, a programmed weapon. He was doing what he was designed to do, destroying by his very nature, incapable of choice or empathy. He was a force of nature like a hurricane or an earthquake. Humans, on the other hand, possess reason, empathy, and the ability to choose. Yet, they willingly, knowingly, and repeatedly choose to destroy the world and each other out of their petty ambitions, their deep-seated hatreds, and their blinding arrogance. The Night King's real goal was to plunge the world into a permanent, peaceful silence. But the ultimate tragedy of the story is that humanity proved it did not even need him to bring about its own destruction. They were perfectly capable of creating their own apocalypse. Ultimately, the White Walkers were nothing more than the physical bill for humanity's crimes, and the darkest, most honest mirror of our own flawed existence. We spent years debating, arguing, and theorizing about who would ultimately sit on the Iron Throne. But when the winter winds finally blew and the ashes fell like snow over King's Landing, we saw the bitter truth. The metal the throne was made of didn't matter at all, because the people fighting for it had already lost their humanity.